All right, thanks for coming everybody to our first About Music Education lecture of this semester. We're mixing it up a bit this semester with different nights, not just Mondays at 5 o'clock, and we've got a range of interesting speakers, obviously beginning with one of our stars tonight. We've got some hands-on sessions, so keep an eye on the comms website if you're interested to see what else we've got coming in the series this semester. It's about half up there so far, the other half will be coming soon. So, to tonight. Normally when one has a visiting professor of such great international standing as Professor Karpinski, their research precedes them. But at the Sydney Conservatorium of Music, Gary is somewhat of a rock star, because all of our students struggle through his books because our course is based on them. And it's his textbooks that we actually know him for first and foremost. It was very, very nice for me to have Gary as a guest speaker in one of my courses, Composition in Music Education, on Tuesday, and to actually hear for the first time how his extensive research background, which we don't know as much about, has influenced that practice and the practice, his teaching practice, and what has led to those incredibly successful rockstar books. And I think that's exactly what we're in for tonight, looking at the topic, building bridges, research and practice in oral skills training. I'm sure that you're going to learn, just as we did, what a remarkable connection Gary brings to both research and practice together. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Karpinski.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thanks so much. Very quickly, how many of you were at one of those two talks on Tuesday? Let me just see hands. There will be a little bit of overlap with that, just necessarily because of the topics, but I promise you once we get past some of that overlap, there's an awful lot of new stuff too. So first of all, I'd like to thank this fine institution for inviting me to give this talk. It's always a pleasure for me to share my work, and this is a very special venue for doing just that. I want in particular to thank Christopher Cody, who's not here, for initiating this and organizing all of that, and for James and Daniel for being such fine hosts while I'm here. I am going to give this as a formal talk, and that means I'm going to read from a typescript. I promise you that I will not bore you with that, but I just find that when time is of the essence, that it's important for me to distill things and make sure that I get things timed properly. And those of you that have heard me already know that I do like to take asides, and the typescript keeps me back on track. So, in 1993, David Butler and Mark Lochstampfor published an article entitled Bridges Unbuilt, Oral Training and Cognitive Science. In this insightful essay, they lamented that, quote, there simply does not seem to have been a widespread effort to identify, gather, evaluate, and synthesize experimental results from the research area of music cognition so that they may be applied directly to oral training in our college music programs, unquote. I'm here today to discuss that lacuna and the things that are being done now to build bridges between work in music cognition and perception on the one hand and oral skills training on the other. So I'd like to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes or so, and then leave some time for questions and discussions after that. So I'll limit my topics to the following. This could be more extensive, but I picked these 5 areas. Short-term musical memory, that's where some of the overlap with Tuesday occurs. Solmization systems, interval training, absolute pitch, and eye movements while sight reading. So those will be our 5 topics for the day. Let's first think about short-term musical memory. Memory for individual pitches, melodic memory, and extractive memory all contribute to various levels of achievement and diverse kinds of difficulties in our students' listening work. But unless we're keenly aware of the different ways that these memory behaviors can affect student achievement, and unless we have reliable methods for diagnosing individual students' strengths and weaknesses in each of these behaviors, we have little hope of implementing appropriate and efficacious remedial activities in order to improve listening skills. Now, the simplest kind of musical memory is for single pitches. I make a clear distinction between pitch matching and pitch memory. And this is something, those of you who are going, how many of you plan on going out into a career in teaching one way or another? Let me just see hands. Yeah, if you're working with students when you're teaching, one of the things you may do is some work with pitch matching. There's a clear distinction to be made between pitch matching and pitch memory. If we ask a student, or anyone for that matter, to match a pitch while we are sustaining the pitch, say on the piano or with our voices, then we're engaging a feedback loop in which students rapidly monitor the relationship between the stimulus we provide and the response that they give. Memory plays essentially no role in this process. It's an instantaneous and continual feedback loop. But if we play or sing a pitch and then stop and ask them to repeat the pitch only after it stops sounding, then we're testing the most basic kind of pitch memory. Where things get interesting is when pitches are combined together into melodies. By the way, one would think that memory for individual pitches and memory for melody, that there'd be sort of a Venn diagram relationship between the two, that you'd have a big population of people that could hear a pitch and then sing it back, and then a subset of that population who could hear a melodic fragment and then be able to sing it back. It turns out that it's not exactly that perfect, that there's a bit of people that sort of nudge outside that Venn diagram who have difficulty matching individual pitches or remembering individual pitches, but do much better when they hear pitches in melodic context. It's probably analogous to asking someone to repeat a phoneme as opposed to repeating a word. Sometimes the phoneme's more difficult. Any of you who've raised young children know that they are not very capable early on breaking, say, the word cat into a k, an a, and a t. That's more difficult than the word cat, and I think this kind of melodic context is analogous to that. So things do get interesting when pitches are combined into melodies. We know from studies of memory in general. And by the way, there's a reference list at the back, and I'm going to be referring to some studies. So if anybody's curious and following up on any of this stuff, I'll be mentioning names, and the reference list is all arranged alphabetically for you. George Miller, in his classic 1956 study on memory in general, and on music in particular, Marple, Tellerico, Long, and Pembroke, that listeners who hear a melody they've never heard before can usually remember between 6 and 10 bits of information from it. For many students who are new to this kind of training, 6 to 10 bits are equivalent to 6 to 10 pitches. And this is why my manual for ear training and sight singing begins with 9 chapters of short melodic fragments, none of which is more than 10 pitches long. Restricting work early in the curriculum to such short melodies allows us to focus on skills like meter perception, rhythm comprehension, tonic inference, and scale degree identification without the complications introduced by longer materials. When it does come time to introduce phrase-length melodies in dictation work, things get even more interesting. Dictation melodies that comprise more than a dozen notes are intentionally longer than just about every student can remember in one listening. Some oral skills textbooks encourage students to try to memorize such long melodies before beginning to write anything. But work by researchers such as Sloboda and Parker has shown that even on successive hearings, listeners do not improve their memories of such melodies. And I mentioned the Sloboda and Parker study on Tuesday. It was really quite interesting. What they did was they took subjects in for this study. They'd play melodies for them that were 20 to 30 notes in length and gave them one instruction: please sing back what you remember. And then they'd play the same melody again and say, please sing back what you remember. And then they'd play the same melody again. And as I recall, they did this 6 times in a row for melody number 1. Then they go on to melody number 2 and they do the same thing, and then melody number 3 and do the same thing. A lot of work, for a subject to go through 6 iterations of a handful of melodies. But what was interesting, what Sloboda and Parker concluded, was that subjects' responses got longer, but they didn't get any better. It was as if the subjects in this study felt obligated to sing something longer on the 2nd iteration and the 3rd iteration, but their responses didn't have any more correct information. There were just more notes, mistakes and correct notes and things along the way. And something I found very interesting was that by the time they got down to melody 3 or 4, pieces from melody 1 started to show up in melody 4 and so on. It's just human nature, I think. What does the Sloboda and Parker study tell us? That if people try to pile on 2 measures, and then after another listening 3 measures, another listening 4 measures, and so on. That way leads madness. So one of the issues here is a cognitive one that I've labeled retroactive interference. So, sorry, one that is labeled retroactive interference, that I label the skill that we use to address this extractive memory, but more on that in a minute. Psychologists have learned that forgetting is not so much a product of time passing as it is of new information driving out previous information. I think that's fascinating. We tend to think of memory as decaying over time, but it's actually decaying because new information is coming into the subject's mind. Back when everyone used to have to memorize phone numbers, I used to make an analogy about this to say that if you were trying to memorize a phone number, you looked it up in an old paper phone book and you had to walk across the room to the phone that was tied to the cord. People used to give others a hard time going 73298. Oh darn, and you'd have to go back and you have to look it up again. Right? And why was that? It was because those new numbers were coming in. And they've actually shown that it's the same modality that interferes with memory. So if I'm trying to memorize a series of numbers and someone plays a melody for me, I can interfere that much. But if I try to memorize a series of numbers and someone's calling out numbers to me, that's going to interfere a lot. And the converse is true also. If I'm trying to memorize a melody and someone's yelling out numbers, it's just sort of an annoyance. But if they start humming a different tune, it's like, stop it, I can't remember what that is. That's just how short-term memory works. When our students hear a typical dictation length melody, human nature dictates that they'll have difficulty remembering all of it. Indeed, the so-called serial curve for memory applies here. And they've done this in study after study, memorizing grocery lists, numbers, names, events in history, melodic material, you name it. You can come up with a graph and you can, let's say, have 10 items that a person needs to memorize in one go. And then you give this to a room full of people, and then you do a bar graph. How many people remember the first item? How many remember the second? And so on. And you get this curve. At the beginning, most people remember the first 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 items or so, but it kind of ramps down. And then when you get to about the 6th item or so, that's where the weakest is. And then, whoops, at the end, it pops up. This is called the primacy and the recency effect. We tend to remember things at the beginning of a series and an end of a series, and the weakest spot is about 60% of the way through, whatever those events are. And this holds true for melodies as well. Initial items are recalled, followed by some fuzziness in the middle. Perhaps a few of the most recent items were remembered at the end. Of course, there's variability among human responses to this, but overall, those are the kind of things that we see and hear. So let's listen to this in situ with regard to music. Here's a recording of a student asked to sing back just such a melody. And for those of you, again, that were here on Tuesday, this is where some of the overlap goes. This is an identical recording of what we had on Tuesday. So this was a student who was seeing nothing. She was hearing me play something for her on the piano, and then simply asked her to sing it back after I was done playing. So you can hear her difficulties. Although her response was rather musical, she hesitated. And she got about half of the pitches wrong overall. Rhythmically, it's pretty good. Contour-wise, it's good. But she got about 50% of the pitches wrong. But now listen to what happens when that same student is presented with a new melody, same length, but she's instructed to extract only the first half of the melody after one listening. And then, given a second listening, instructed to extract only the second half. So what you'll miss in this next recording is my instructions at the beginning, which is listen to the whole thing, but only sing back the beginning for me. What you hear then simply is me playing the piano, her singing back, and then in between that and down here, you'll hear me instruct her to now only sing the second half. And you can hear the difference in her responses.
Okay, I'm going to play it again, and this time I want you to just sing the second half. Ignore that first half entirely and just sing the second half back. Here we go.
So as far as pitch is concerned, she went from 50% to 100%. Yes, she did have a second listening, but I do have some other recordings of people trying to pile on and go with a second listening and a third listening and always start at the beginning. And for many students, that's quite difficult. So this kind of divide and conquer strategy, this extractive listening that I've talked about is quite important. So you can hear how successful she was in managing her memory, working with what nature has given her using this technique. Once she learned to approach dictation this way, her grades improved markedly. But that's just a means to an end. The ability to remember certain musical passages to the exclusion of surrounding stimuli is a skill that performers, conductors, teachers, composers, all musicians use all the time. Just think in your own life the number of times that you've had to focus on a particular passage out of a larger context. And is that a discipline that you picked up intuitively? Is it something that you struggle with? Is it something that you're quite strong at? And it's really one of the gifts that I think that I'm privileged to be able to give music students by working with this kind of technique. We all know that as students become more sophisticated in their musical theoretic skills, the number of pitches that they can recall from novel melodies can increase. You know, I'm sure some of you are thinking 6 to 10 notes, that doesn't sound like many, I can remember more. It's like, yeah, what's happening? What kind of sophisticated listening is going on that's allowing you to remember more than just 6 to 10 items out of a passage? This can be done through a process that technically is called chunking. Allow me to demonstrate. In just a moment, I'm going to read a string of 13 letters to you, you know, C, Q, R, that kind of thing. Please listen carefully and remember the letters in order. Don't write anything. Test your memory instead. I know it's going to be tempting to try to write it down, but then you might as well just go out and play cricket here or whatever. And here they are, or AFL. I watched my first AFL game the other night. All right. So here are the letters. Here you go. N, W, E, L, D, N, U, A, D, O, R, N. Okay, here you go. N, W, E, L, D, N, U, A, D, O. Okay, now, and yes. Now, did you hear the serial curve? Remember, you could hear it in the dynamics in the room. We started loud and it got a little quiet, and then it started to get loud towards the end again. Yes. So that's just a perfect demonstration of what happens when we try to remember things beyond that's. It's actually, when it's not musical, it's 5 to 9 items. Interestingly, when it's pitch and rhythm combined, we tend to be able to remember 6 to 10. It's 5 to 9 for other things. How many of you think you got all 13 of those? Let me see hands. Okay, just one person. What kind of strategy did you use?
Well, the first one was like new but turned around, and the second one was like Lord but just the beginning and the end, and then I just remember the rest.
Yeah, now, isn't that interesting? So what was she doing? She was chunking, right? Instead of NWE, 3 items, she saw it as 1, the word new but inverted, right? And then LD, so Lord, that's a single concept, a single bit of information, that got 2. So you got 5 of those bits down into 2 bits of information, and the rest of it, worked pretty well for you. Well, let's play around with this idea of chunking a little bit. Your successful strategies, anybody who did well at all at this, involves some kind of chunking. Bits of information may be chunked into meaningful groups as they're encoded in memory, thereby increasing the total amount of information capable of being encoded. Every one of you chunked this material to some extent, I guarantee it. You at least took the separate phonemes in a sound like W that has a bunch of phonemes and encoded it as the 23rd letter of the modern Roman alphabet. That's a kind of chunking. We've had this experience listening to a foreign language. When you don't understand something, you hear this series of phonemes and you try to rearrange it and think about what was it that the person was saying. That's because of that information overload that's happening there. But when we can hear something as a percept, like W, it makes it easy. Others may have chunked certain groups of letters, like the OR towards the end, or the NW, the NW at the beginning, and so on. Let's try the same task. I'm going to give you those same 13 letters again, but I'm going to give them to you in a different order. Same letters, different order. Listen carefully and remember the letters in order. Here they are. L, L-A-N-D-O-W-N-U-N-D-E-R. Say them back to me. Here we go. L-A-N-D-O-W-N-U-N-D-E-R. Okay, so what did you do? You engaged in a much more sophisticated kind of chunking. At the very least, grouping those letters into 3 meaningful words, and most likely a single easily memorable chunk, the idea of a place that's important to you. Right? So that's what chunking does for you. And the same thing works in music as well as in language. Musical memory can make use of this same kind of chunking, so let's do the same kind of memory test with a group of what psychologists call isochronous pitches, pitches of equal duration. Listen to the following 13 pitches. I don't want you to use your visual cues here, so don't look at what I play at the keyboard, but I want you to listen to, rather than 13 letters, 13 pitches this time, and I'm going to ask you to try to sing these back. You can sing them back in whatever octave is comfortable for you. I'm going to play them in the 5 octave, the treble, upper treble register. So here you go, 13 pitches, try to remember them. I'll do you a favor, I'll give you a starting note. Anywhere there, try it out. Here we go, just on Lu. Lu. Okay, there it is. Again, you see that primacy effect? It's like, oh, I'm pretty confident. No, I'm not. And here we are down at the bottom. It's a funny feeling, right? Same game, same kind of thing we just did. I'm taking those 13 pitches that you just heard, and I'm going to play them in a different order. And let's see if you can use some kind of chunking technique to be able to remember all 13 of these pitches. So here they are again. I'm starting in a different place, but it's the same group of pitches, just scrambled up differently. Here it is. All right, try it from there. Here we go on Lu. Lu. Much better, right? So what did you do? What were your strategies? Anybody tell me how you were able to chunk that? Yes? Okay, so you heard a triad at the very beginning, right? And probably even tonic triad at the very beginning, but that's one percept there, and then scalar. So, ba-da-da, and then da-da-dee-da-da. And how many of you said, okay, I heard something scalar, I better remember where it starts and ends. So maybe 3 bits of information. Scale is 1 bit, and starting with so, and going down to so for the octave, and then at the end? Dominant triad, and then a cadence. Yeah, so what is that? Maybe about 5 bits of information, well within the limits of short-term memory. So Marple, Long, Potter, other writers all address the musical implications of chunking in greater detail. The more we train students to understand what they hear, the more we aid them in improving their musical memory. And I view teaching students to use and improve their musical memory to be a crucial part of our work. And this is something, for whatever reason, I once went to a talk decades ago, and it was a group of scholars who had just gotten tenure at a university. And they were talking about what it takes in order to earn tenure. And one gentleman on this panel said, you get 1 or 2 good ideas in your career, and you run with it. And I thought that was very interesting as a very young person to hear that. And I think that's my good idea, is that memory is a crucial aspect of this. There was nothing in the literature before I started doing research on this and writing on this about the effect of memory on dictation taking. And it turns out to me, not only is it important to be able to take dictation, but so who cares if you can take dictation? There are no careers in that. But it's crucial for musicians to be able to use their musical memory, and dictation is a way of focusing a light on musical memory and using it as a diagnostic tool to then say, all right, what's going wrong with musical memory? Are you not chunking here? Are you not using extractive listening? And so on and so forth. So that's musical memory. That's one aspect. That's our first topic today. Now let's move on to solmization systems for a bit. In North America, and it may be true in other places in the world, but my personal experience in North America, arguments about solmization systems burn quietly, like an underground coal fire, occasionally breaking through to the surface with copious amounts of smoke and occasionally flames. These breakthroughs usually occur at scholarly conferences, sometimes even over a meal shared by otherwise amicable scholars, but hardly ever make an appearance among colleagues within any particular institution. The matter of solmization having been settled at that institution sometime earlier, usually shortly after the department's crust had just cooled. One such argument about solmization systems centers on whether to use a fixed or a movable system. Now, as I've commented on extensively in my book, Aural Skills Acquisition, both types of systems have their place in aural skills training. When working to instill the reading of specific pitches, as in clef reading and in transposition, then a fixed system, like fixed do or letter names, is suitable. But when working to instill tonal function, then a movable system, like numbers or movable do, is appropriate. Nonetheless, a special kind of North American argument ensues when the topic of movable do solmization is raised. Should we use Labased minor or Doughbase minor? And if you look in the reference list, there's a whole series of articles by Houlihan and Taka and then Timothy Smith. And they appeared, I mean, they're alphabetically organized, but if you look at them in the pages of the Journal Music Theory Pedagogy, you have the article by Timothy Smith, and then another issue comes out, and it's Houlihan and Taka, and then Tim Smith again, and then Houlihan and Taka, and they're firing salvos back and forth at one another. Now, Steve Larson most succinctly summed up the fundamental differences between these two systems. Law-based minor movable do explicitly models the position of the pitches within a diatonic collection without regard to tonic, whereas do-based minor movable do explicitly models the scale degree functions of pitches in relation to a tonic. Put another way, the law-based system fixes the positions of the half steps and whole steps to mi and fa and ti and do, whereas the do-based system simply fixes the position of the tonic or do. These are two different approaches to using the same kind of syllable systems. So I have a paragraph here. I'll read through it. I already mentioned it. The exchange that has come to embody the differences between these two systems. Smith and Houlihan and Taka argued over points concerning the efficacy of these systems in developing music, reading, and listening skills. There are also other studies about these. Moulter, 78, Martin, 78, Suris, Smith, Lorek et al. They use similar criteria for evaluating various systems. But their results are at odds with one another and inconclusive. And none of those researchers made any reference to the scientific literature on tonal perception. So let's consider the perception and cognition involved in music listening as essential criteria in selecting between these two solmization systems so that we can come to some conclusions. Drawing on the aural key identification studies of Brown, Butler, and Jones, and the model for music perception I developed in a 1990 article in the Journal Music Theory Pedagogy, we can conclude that the first and most fundamental process that listeners carry out while attending to the pitches of tonal music is tonic inference. Butler provided a compact description of the dynamic nature of this process, and I quote, "Any tone will suffice as a perceptual anchor, a tonal center, until a better candidate defeats it." Let me give you an example of this, because it's one thing to talk about this in the abstract, but if I start playing something like this for you, do you have any idea where you think the tonic is? Sing it. Interesting, yeah, some of you went on, some of you went down. So we're not sure, there's some disagreement there, but if I went on like this and I did this, where's the tonic now? Suddenly it changes, it becomes clearer. So a note can take on the role of tonic until something supersedes it and overtakes it. This is what allows modulation to take place. Right? It's because music is a dynamic thing that happens over time, and so we're not sure. And whenever we're hearing the beginning of something, all of a sudden it becomes clear after 2, 3, 4 notes, and the light goes on. And usually the kinds of clues that our brains pick up about what is the tonic are all pointing in the same direction. Ambiguous music, like that first group of 13 pitches that I played for you, it was a white note diatonic collection. It was all the notes out of C major, A minor, D Dorian, whatever, but I played them in such an order that it was ambiguous. And then the second one was rather clear because of the ordering of things. So tonality can be vague and sometimes even ambiguous, but it can also be quite clear. One of the roles of composers, I think, in the tonal era was to try to make tonality clear. There are very few passages where composers are talking about how to write in a key, but those few passages are actually quite interesting. So let's think about that then, this idea that any tone can suffice as a perceptual anchor until a better candidate defeats it, and this idea that there could be factors like perfect fifths. We tend to hear the lower note of a perfect fifth as being a tonic, so that's why when I was only playing these two notes, you really weren't sure, but then when I went, as soon as I gave you that perfect fifth, our ears latch onto that lower note of the perfect fifth, the upper note of a perfect fourth. That starts to create a factor that makes us think, okay, I think the upper note is half-step relationships. We tend to hear the upper note of half-step relationships as a tonic. And when all these things are pointing at the same note in our minds, it's like, clear, I know exactly what key we're in. From this, I conclude that the single most immediately knowable tonal feature of nearly all tonal music is the tonic. In addition, a tonic is inferable without reference to a complete diatonic pitch collection. As Butler and Brown and Jones noted, quote, ordinary listeners are able to make tonal decisions quickly from partial and even fleeting musical evidence, unquote. Melodies that are unambiguous with regard to their tonic might state the diatonic pitch classes only gradually. They might never employ all 7 diatonic pitch classes, or they might even change the diatonic collection without changing the tonic. And in this, I differ slightly from Brown and Butler in that the rare intervals of the diatonic collection, there's this whole thing called a rare interval theory, that those are the markers that place us within the diatonic collection, the semitones, the tritone. But I think that those in fact I know, they need not be present at all. Yet, nonetheless, we are able to infer tonics quickly and dynamically under any of the above conditions. As Butler noted, listeners make assessments of tonal centers swiftly and apparently without conscious effort. And they often do so well in advance of inferring or perceiving entire diatonic pitch collections. Now I'm setting this table to then compare the two different solmization systems, the Doughbase and the Labased. So here we go. Doughbase minor movable Do solmization most closely models this mental process. This stands in stark contrast with Labased minor and its inherent inability to model the pitches of a musical passage until all 7 of its diatonic members are explicitly stated or at least implicitly present. I'm getting old, this is 20 years ago. In a 1997 paper, I showed several examples of musical passages, excerpts from music literature and passages specifically designed by authors for use in teaching dictation that either unfold their diatonic collections gradually or never present a complete diatonic collection at all. Of the latter variety is the opening measure to the overture from Wagner's Flying Dutchman, shown here in this slide. And let's just listen to this. The collected pitch classes from all instruments that you just heard through the downbeat of measure 6 constitute a mere dyad, D and A. Yet listeners almost immediately infer D as tonic when hearing this passage. What does that have to do with? What were we talking about before? The perfect fourth, the perfect fifth. Right? We hear those in that kind of arrangement, our brains immediately gravitate towards that D. The most instantaneous tonal inference we make is to zero in on a tonic pitch. So a tonic-oriented solmization system, such as Do-based movable Do, or numbers for that matter, accommodates this mental process with ease. As soon as listeners orally identify a tonic pitch, they can assign Do, or 1, to that tonic and start calculating the other scale degrees from there as the music proceeds. In this example, it would be so, do, so, right? And we would start doing it that way, or 5, 1, 1, 5, 1, 1, 5. Because we have that 1, we can measure everything from there. In contrast, listeners using a collection-oriented system, like Labased movable do, must of necessity wait until they hear all 7 pitches in a diatonic collection before they can begin to assign pitch labels without fear of being undermined. Excuse me. For example, while tonic-oriented listeners are already hearing so do for the A and D in the Flying Dutchman, collection-oriented listeners might think so do if major, but mi la if minor. Or maybe some other perfect 4-syllable pair, because this could, maybe we don't know, maybe it's in Dorian, maybe it's in Phrygian, we have no way of knowing. And they can't know until they hear the entire diatonic collection. In fact, this distinction between the two systems comes into marked contrast when we address modal music. Collection-oriented movable do is often referred to as la-bass minor, but that's a convenient synecdoche. It's actually do-bass major, re-bass Dorian, right? Mi-bass Phrygian, and so on. Consider for a moment the Beatles' Norwegian Wood, the beginning of which you'll see now in this next figure. By the way, if you don't know about this, there's a wonderful book by 4 Japanese scholars that takes all of the Beatles' oeuvre and it transcribes it. So it's not just, lead sheets or fake book, but it's actually, here's what the sitar's playing, here's the guitar, here's the bass, here's what John's singing, here's what Paul's singing. I received this, did anybody know this? It's really wonderful. I received it as a gift, and I keep going back to it all the time. So here it is from their book. And this is the beginning of Norwegian Wood, and let's just take a listen to this. So Norwegian Wood doesn't reveal all 7 of its diatonic pitch classes until measure 2, beat 2. Right? So here we are all the way through this beat, beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, beat 4, beat 1 here. We don't get to the 7th pitch class until we hear this D natural there. So up to that point, we have what's known as a gap diatonic collection. A little bit more about that in a minute. But as Butler and Brown's model shows, listeners begin to infer a tonal center from the outset. You would sing, in this instance, an E and say, that's the tonal center, that's the tonic or final, as it were. E asserts itself by virtue of its position as the lowest pitch in a perfect fifth, whose members are always perceived in that tonic-dominant relationship in the absence of other overpowering factors. Through measure 1 to the downbeat of measure 2, the so-called strong first and third beats form the major triad E, G sharp, and B, as shown by the beam notes in figure 3a, thereby adding the mediant tonic relationship and strengthening E's status as a tonic. Indeed, by the time we reach measure 2, beat 1, there should be little doubt among tonally savvy listeners that the tonic is E. But wait, these 5 beats have unfolded only a hexachordal collection, a subset of the diatonic collection whose 7th diatonic member might be either D sharp or D natural. What's a solmization system to do? Well, let's take a look at this and see. Figure 4a shows how a collection-oriented system, such as La-bass minor, models complete diatonic collections. Observe that the 4-sharp collection, marked by the top bracket, places semitones at the points G sharp and A and D sharp and E. So we've got those here, G sharp and A and D sharp and E. Now, of course, I walked away and I lost my place, so hang on for a second. They're assigned to the syllables mi, fa, and ti, do, respectively, in a la-based system. The other syllables fall in line. Now, observe the differences affected by replacing D sharp with D natural. The resulting 3-sharp collection, marked by the bottom bracket in figure 4a, still at the top of the screen, but the bottom bracket, that places semitones at the points G sharp and A and C sharp and D, to which a collection-oriented system assigns, again, Ti, Do, and Mi, Fa in that order. Note that every pitch is now assigned a new syllable, even though their scale degree functions may not have changed. And that's sort of the point, it is the point of a collection-oriented system, is to simply just put your half steps where mi, fa, and ti, do fall. So down here, we've got this now as ti, do, and this is mi, fa instead. And so you would solmize your E scale in Mixolydian as sol, la, ti, do, re, mi, fa, so. Figure 4b, towards the bottom, shows the dilemma posed by applying a collection-oriented system to the hexachordal diatonic subset presented by beats 1 to 5 of Norwegian wood. The system cannot know whether D or D sharp would complete the collection. Thus, it cannot place both semitones, and therefore the status of all pitch-syllable relationships is in doubt. An internally valid collection-oriented system cannot say anything about these pitches until the collection is completed on the 6th beat. As Wittgenstein noted, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Now, let's compare figure. And by the way, this is just a little example, and I like Norwegian woods, but there are longer ones. One of the examples I've used for this is the La Marmee tune. Bum 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 ya ba bum ba 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 bum ba ba ba. All you're getting is 5 notes out of the diatonic collection. Is that so? Is it sorry, mi 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 re do ti la? Or is it la 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 so fa mi re? And it's only when you get through, like, note 27 that suddenly you realize, oh my gosh, I have to change what I thought was la to re. And so this is one of the problems with a la-based. I mean, there are other advantages, but when you're talking about this from a perceptual perspective, this is one of the problems with a collection-oriented system. So let's go on to a different slide here. So now here we are in figure 5, a tonally oriented solmization system, Doughbase minor, or numbers for that matter, assigns syllables on the basis of the position of the tonic. So given E as tonic, which we hear right from the get-go, it's solmized as do regardless of whether D sharp or D natural will complete the collection. And in fact, regardless of whether you've got an F sharp or an F natural or a C sharp or a C natural, it doesn't matter. If we hear that E as the tonic, then we assign do to it. Note the assignment of T to D sharp, but te gesundheit to D natural. This approach has its origins at least far back as Mersenn's addition of the syllables C, Ci, and B, Bi for the whole and half steps above la, respectively. And you can look to the Gruber article in there for more information on that. Figure 5 shows that no dilemma exists for tonally oriented systems when approaching the diatonic subset presented by beats 1 to 5 of Norwegian wood. As has been demonstrated, E's status as tonic is quite clear from the outset. Therefore, we assign do to E, the other syllables are assigned in relation to that tonic, and the T-te ambiguity is simply not a factor until it's determined to be te on beat 6. Staying in the Beatles, we could do the same thing with Eleanor Rigby, right? That starts out, if you use a tonic-oriented system, you'd be in minor and Dorian, and it does flip between the two because of the chromatic change. Doesn't matter, do stays the same. Sometimes you're singing le, other times you're singing la, but the syllables all remain immutable with that, the exception of that one change. Whereas a so-called la-based system would have to treat it as la when the melody's minor, but then re when the melody's Dorian, and you're flipping all your other syllables at that point. Now, please note that none of this precludes choosing from various solmization systems to develop other modes of musical thought. For instance, reading the letter names of absolute pitches, or reading in fixed do, which is functionally equivalent, can, as I've mentioned, develop clef reading skills and transposition and whatnot. Reading in la-based minor can develop a sensitivity to relative keys, which is important. And in fact, there's certain kinds of music literature for which sight singing lends itself best for using a la-based minor, do-based major approach, like the Eastern European folk tunes that Kodai used and based his system on, or for that matter, if you're looking at, say, Renaissance vocal literature like the motets of Lassus and Palestrina. Very easy to just leave your mi, fa, ti, do half steps where they fall and let the internal cadences fall on re and sol and mi and so on. So there are certain times when when it really is better. But when we're talking about taking tonal perception as our point of departure and as an essential criterion, we find that Doughbase, movable Dough, most accurately is analogous to the cognitive process of tonic inference and associated scale degree identification. All right, so what is this? Topic 3, interval training. Many of us with gray hair, or perhaps no hair at all, received some of our first formal oral skills training during the last century via what Mike Rogers calls atomistic drills. Lots of isolated intervals, chords, rhythms are presented acontextually for listeners to identify. I know that a lot of my very early training was like this. Indeed, large swaths in textbooks and major portions of curricula were devoted to drilling and testing students' abilities to detect and classify the structure of chords and the distance between two pitches in campo aperto. It was not unusual to sit down for 10 minutes of drill in an oral skills class and have to write out lists of answers. What is that? What is that? And so on. Very typical. And in fact, there are entire books, kid you not, entire books full of nothing but intervals. This was the epitome of efficient modern ear training, capable of being drilled by just about any human, or for that matter, a computer. Easily testable and quantifiable, resulting in unassailable numerical scores. And in fact, they used to have what we called confusion tables, and you'd have minor second, major second, minor third, perfect third, and then the other axis, minor second, major, and you could see the little dots where you confused a minor second with a minor third, or a tritone with an augmented fifth, or something like that, as if this information was useful. But it was very, very technical, and it looked scary. Starting nearly 40 years ago, research began to appear that questioned the efficacy of this approach. Merton Shatskin, one of my favorites, and others, showed that there's very little correspondence between listeners' abilities to identify isolated intervals and their abilities to hear and understand pitches within a tonal context. Mike Rogers wrote that teaching tonal hearing goes beyond interval training. He had an article entitled Beyond Intervals. And various researchers found that Western listeners remember and understand tonal music in terms of diatonic collections, scale degree functions, contour, not as a series of intervals between pitches. And you can look at Shepard and Jordan, Dowling and Harwood for some research on that. Shatskin's probably one of the most interesting ones. He did a sort of meta-analysis of about a dozen different studies of interval training and concluded that none of them showed that people who got better at that actually got better at doing things in musical context, and vice versa. There are people who are doing really good stuff in musical context, and you ask them about intervals, and they'd go, what? So what's going on there? So how many of us listen to, say, the second movement of Haydn's 104th and think, minor second, minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, minor seventh. Do you do that? You do that. Good, you're all healthy, okay. All right. That's tantamount to listening to a Shakespeare play and thinking, that's a noun, that's a verb, that's an adjective, that's a conjunction. It's all true, and it's even testable, isn't it? But it misses the meaning entirely. It also makes the passage less comprehensible and less easily remembered. Scale degree function carries so much musical meaning and has such profound effects on the way we encode and understand tonal music that it seems almost irresponsible not to indoctrinate our students with a system that inculcates them with this important layer of meaning rather than focusing on all of these little atomistic bits. Even more general features such as melodic contour, step versus skip content, those things carry more useful meaning than the bare naked distances between one pitch and the next. Indeed, intervals can take on different characteristics depending upon their tonal context. Classic example is the tritone ambiguity, right? For example, pitch classes 0 and 6. If I just ask you to think about those two notes right there, well, it depends upon what context you hear them in, how you might respond to them. So here's the stimulus that we think of as this, bare naked interval, and it really doesn't have function or features or characteristics unless you're bringing baggage with you that you shouldn't necessarily be bringing. But if I do something like this, let's do this, and then I play this. What does that top note want to do for you? Right, like that. But how about if I do the same thing in a different context? Where's that top note want to go? Right? So write the same distance, 0 to 6, pitch C in F sharp or G flat, depending upon how we're spelling it in that larger context. Going to have a very, very different kind of effect on you because of the context around it. So in the first instance, you were hearing those as fa and T, and in the second instance, you were hearing them as T and fa, and that T wanted to go up and the fa wanted to go down, and so on. Other intervals are similarly multifarious. That's an obvious one. It's a really, really clear one. And they don't even need to be respelled. Take as just one example the ascending major sixth. So here's a nice little tune, and this I believe is out of either the first or now the new edition of my anthology. But it's from Brahms, and it's from one of the 9 songs, Opus 69. The interval form between the first 2 pitches is a major 6 in its locus classicus, from scale degree 5 up to 3. But now look ahead to the interval form between the last note in measure 9 and the first note in measure 10. That's the same interval, but this time it's from scale degree 1 up to 6. And here's Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau singing this. Now, tonally enculturated listeners perceive a different affect in each of these 2 incarnations of the major 6. The so to me one is a different feel, it has a different function, even though it may happen to be the same size. But now let's take a look at figure 7, which will appear at the bottom of the screen. And let's listen to this also, and notice the circled. I know it's a little bit hard to see it in this light here, but this interval is circled here in that particular spot. And so here we go with an instance of yet another major 6. The first 2 notes in measure 7 also form an ascending major 6. But in real time, as the music progresses, I and most Western listeners find it difficult to disassociate these 2 pitches from their context in the Mozart and categorize them with the other 2 major 6s in the Brahms song. Indeed, the contexts make profound differences. The fact that these 2 notes are scale degrees 4 and 2 in this instance in the Mozart, and in the minor mode rather than the major mode, and that they're members of a dominant 6/5 chord, that they form part of a sequential compound melody voice leading progression. All these facts are part of the essential qualia that set the Mozart's major 6 apart from either of Brahms's. For many, the fact that the distance between these various pairs of pitches, these 3, the fact that it's identical comes as a kind of an afterthought. And in fact, I challenge you, anytime you're listening to a passage of music with another musician, or for that matter, they've played something for you, ask them this question. What was the interval between the 3rd and 4th note from the end? Whether it was what they just played or sang, or what they did. And you'll get this. Sometimes you get, but other times you'll get, oh, it was a perfect 4th. Right? They can do it because we've all been trained to do it in music school, but they weren't thinking about it. We don't attend to intervals along the way. It's not our normal mode of thinking in tonal music. So this really brings into light one of the limitations of using familiar tunes as part of aural skills training. Certainly, My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean is an iconic embodiment of an ascending major 6th. But only of that major 6th, from scale degree 5 up to 3, the initial one in the Brahms here. But not this one, and certainly not that one. So the difficulty is that we're asking, if we're using, saying, well, you can learn all major 6 by learning My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean, is you're asking someone to yank themselves out of the minor mode context, the scale degree context that you have here, and instead put themselves in an entirely other context to try to just simply get 2 scale degrees that they would hear as fa and re in a tonal context much more easily. So here's an analogous illustration in the visual domain, and one of the most striking demonstrations of human perception that I have ever seen. So let's take a look at this. And I'm going to turn these lights off so it's really clear what's going on there. I am night blind, so we'll see what happens here. Actually, I should probably yank the phone out, and that'll make my life a little easier. There we go. Who needs flashlights anymore? The flashlight industry must be in a depression. So take a look at figure 8. It's a representation of the so-called checker shadow illusion. It's created by MIT professor Edward Adelson. So if you Google Adelson and checker shadow, you can get this and a discussion of it and all kinds of explanations and other wonderful visual games that he has. Note the shade of each square at the squares marked A and B. So here's A up here, and there's B down there. In making a comparison of shade, we usually refer to one shade as darker or lighter or the same as the other. What's the case between squares A and B? Now be honest, how many of you feel, not think and say, well, what's he at, what's his game, but how many of you just simply feel that square A is darker than square B? Raise your hands. Good for you, your brains are working. How many think that it's lighter? A is lighter than B. And how many of you think that they're the same shade? See, one hand, same shade. Well, here's figure 8, and I'm not doing no sleight of hand here. Here's the same figure, but now with surrounding stuff covered up. And I'll go back to the original. You can stare at A and see it, and you can stare at B. It's a little hard with B. You think, oh, I think it's getting darker. And because of that, I'm going to do something else here, so give me a minute. It's always dangerous, like when they do demonstrations of the new iPhone or something, it's all pre-programmed and they don't try. I'm going to try this in real time, so here we go. If it fails, sorry. But what I'm doing is this. I took the Adelson figure and I put it into a graphic program here. And this graphic program has this nice little paint pot. And what I can do is I can change the paint pot into an eyedropper. Can you see that? At the very top. So what that does is that sucks up whatever color there is. So for instance, I can suck up this green right, whoops, sorry, I did it wrong. I can suck up this green right here, and now when I dump it in there, you see I have whatever that green was. But watch, I'm going to suck up the A color here. So right there it is, little eyedropper, suck it up, and then boop, dump it in there. And now I'm going to go to the eyedropper, I'm going to suck up the B color, and I'm going to dump it in there and look at it. It's the same thing. You can't believe it. I have this on my refrigerator, and people come into my house, and the first question is, why do you have this on your refrigerator? And then the second question, oh, what's going on there? But no one can believe it. I mean, it's just absolutely quite remarkable to me. But what does this tell us about? It tells us about context and the powerful effect that context can have on us. So the on-screen, or the format that are on the printed page, the shade of the square is identical, but because we see square B falling in the apparent shadow of the green cylinder, which is an area of relative darkness, our visual system interprets the shade as having to be lighter. So it's the context in which the square falls that makes us see the same shade as being so dramatically different, just as the context in which we find musical intervals causes us to hear them so differently. I think there's a nice little book, a nice little monograph to be written on analogs between visual illusions and aural illusions, and there are all kinds of things in the visual domain and the aural domain that seem to be comparable, and there's so much more research on visual perception than there is on aural perception. So just to give you an example, how many of you know about shepherd tones? Anybody know about shepherd tones? Oh, these are wonderful things that they just represent pitch class rather than pitch. And so what you're hearing is like all C's at the same time, and then all C sharps and all D's. And so when you hear a series of shepherd tones going C, C sharp, D, D sharp, so on like that, it seems like you're going up, but then you listen to it for 5 minutes and you realize it's not going up, it's just going through the pitch class circle, right? The analog to that is M.C. Escher's Infinite Stairs, they keep going on. There's a whole bunch of analogs like this, but this is a really nice one, and it demonstrates the effect of context on how we perceive something. I remember when I first began to investigate what perception and cognition research could do to inform our work in the aural-skills classroom. This was back in the early 1980s. I was teaching sight singing and dictation at Temple University in Philadelphia. And I was teaching in a curriculum I'd inherited from the elder colleagues who'd hired me, using techniques I'd seen my teachers use on me not very many years before that. And this included a contextual identification of atomistically presented intervals. So that kind of interval drilling I was telling you about, that's the way I was taught, so we would do that stuff in class too. So one day, I mentioned to one of my classes that I've been finding more and more evidence in my research that interval training doesn't improve students' work with tonal music. Well, one of those students in that class spoke up and she said, "Why don't you practice what you preach?" And I said, "All right, I'll think about that." And then the next day, she came in, she presented me with a little gift, a button inscribed with an interval on the staff, and it was covered with a red circle and a slash through it. And her message was clear: no more intervals. So I took the message to heart. I reworked the curriculum, and I pretty much completely eliminated interval training from my teaching right then and there just to see what would happen, deciding to focus much more time on tonal function. And one of the interesting byproducts of that experiment was that some students who had been struggling with all the interval work were suddenly now doing much better in class. And it was especially heartening in the in the cases of students whose studio instructors had been assuring me, "Oh, these are good students," but had nonetheless been doing poorly with all this interval work. Anecdotally, I noticed an increase in the correlation between students who seemed to achieve well in lessons and ensembles on the one hand, and those who were doing well in my aural skills classes. I became a dogmatic critic at that time of interval training, and I purged it from our curriculum entirely. Now, over the years, I've tempered this stance a little bit. I've noticed that students benefit greatly from close attention to the distinction between the two most basic building blocks in diatonic scales, minor and major seconds, early on in the curriculum. And I tell my freshmen during the second week of classes that they have to be able to sing both of these intervals above and below any given pitch at 3 in the morning at the point of a gun for no credit. The benefits of this training are manifold. We could talk for another half an hour just about what happens when students are able to just simply produce whole and half steps at that point. Similarly, when it comes to grappling with chromatic harmony, the ability to manipulate major and minor thirds and then perfect fourths comes in quite handy. Also, when working with highly chromatic music and tonally unstable passages, the ability to produce or identify a few choice intervals at certain spots is a welcome skill. And finally, curricula that venture into atonality must, of necessity, rely more heavily on intervallic thinking. But even when addressing atonality, it's important that we encourage our students to do more than merely follow their noses from pitch to pitch to pitch, measuring one interval after another. Researchers have never advocated abandoning interval training altogether, just that it should play at most a secondary role in relation to scale degree training when addressing tonal music. All right, so let's move on now to absolute pitch. It's another sacred cow that's often herded through the halls of some music schools. The notion that so-called perfect pitch, or what perception researchers call absolute pitch, or AP, can be taught to adults. I attended a paper at a national conference not too many years ago during which the presenter said, and I quote, "I used fixed-do in my teaching so our students will begin to develop perfect pitch." And I had to decide at the end of her paper whether to question her about this. So I questioned her about this. And I said, "What research can you cite that supported taking this approach that would actually develop absolute pitch?" And she said, "Oh, I haven't done any research, but that's how I was taught." Now, to be fair, that story is merely an anecdote, but it's symptomatic of something I've observed informally many times over the years, and seen in print as well. For example, in their textbook, Sight Singing and Ear Training Through Literature, Levin and Martin instruct students to sing A440 before all exercises. And they say, I quote, "Over a period of time, you will discover that your accuracy will improve until you have virtually memorized the sound of A440. Similarly, in the journal Theory and Practice, Walt Moulter described this kind of training this way. He said, "In a typical classroom approach, the student might be told on the first day to buy an A440 tuning fork and to learn La, the beginning, it is hoped, of what will develop as far as possible in the direction of absolute pitch for students who lack it," unquote. Bear with me for a second. I want to tease that last phrase out. The beginning, it is hoped, of what will develop as far as possible in the direction of absolute pitch. 5 qualifiers, right? They don't say, do this and you'll get absolute pitch. They say, or he says, the beginning, it is hoped, of what will develop as far as possible in the direction of absolute pitch. That to me indicates there was some doubt in his mind. And in fact, if you try to do this, you will find that you will fail. There's no research that supports the idea that 18-year-old human beings who do not possess the skill can develop it through any means. According to Levitin and Zatori, a 2003 article, no documented case in referee journals exists of an adult learning true AP. In fact, Gregerson has found that there's a substantial genetic component in the possession of AP. There are environmental factors as well, but they all occur during a critical learning period, typically between preschool ages and early double digits, 10, 11, maybe 12. The fact that there's an outlier or two just seems to prove the bell curve. So, we should listen to the research who has studied this phenomenon. There's no point in trying to make our students memorize Concert A. I remember when I lived in New York City, there were students riding the subway, heading up to Juilliard, pulling out their tuning forks so they could keep humming A as they made their way up the stairs of the 66th Street exit into Madame Professor's ear training class, fearing a rap on the knuckles should they forget the note by the time that they sat down for class. Their time would have been much better spent on solmization drills, chord arpeggiation, modulatory patterns, and a host of other functional exercises designed to hone their tonal fluency. All right, on to the last topic, eye movements while sight reading. The question of how to develop more fluent sight reading is an interesting one. Lehman and Erickson concluded that the acquisition of sight reading skill is more similar to the majority of other types of expert performance than the acquisition of, say, solo performance, where the musician spends months or years to prepare for the performance of specific pieces. In the sight reading of music and many other types of expert performance, individuals prepare for unknown situations, unquote. In addition, they found that differences in sight reading ability are not directly attributable to innate talent for music or to instrumental technique. They also concluded that the ability to sight read does not necessarily increase with higher general instrumental skill. There's another study, and I haven't cited it here, and at the moment I've forgotten it, what the citation is, but I remember they tried to correlate good sight reading with what instrument a person plays, how many years they've studied that instrument, whether they've studied theory, what their major is in college, and there was no correlation. There was only one thing that correlated strongly with good sight reading skills, and it was how much sight reading a week does that person do. Now, there's a chicken and egg problem there, right? I'm a good sight reader, I'm going to get a job accompanying the ballet class in town. So I'm doing 7 hours of sight reading a week or whatever. Is that because I'm a good sight reader? Am I a good sight reader because I do the ballet class? But I think you can surmise that if you do more of it, you're going to get better at it. But not always. One striking thing I've noticed in my 37 years of teaching aural skills is that when it comes time for sight reading exams at the end of the semester, certain students seem comfortable and fluid, whereas others are quite uncomfortable, hesitant, and strained. And these differences seem not to be strongly affected by whatever new level the student has achieved or what new chapters or even semesters they might have under their belts. And it doesn't even necessarily correspond to how well students had prepared material for class. The sight reading skills seem to have a level independent of those other factors. The differences between these types of sight readers seem to stem from a kind of fluency in the processing of the symbols on the page in real time. And I suspected that this arose from the way that they move their eyes. So I set up a little pseudo experiment. You can see it here in this slide. I created a little artificial sight singing melody, the one that you see there, and used it as part of a final exam one year. I set up the exam so students would sit directly across from me, with only a music stand in front of them, positioned low enough that I could clearly see their eyes. And during the exam, I carefully watched students' eyes as they reached the end of the first line. Sure enough, the weaker readers were staring at the whole note, or semibreve, sorry folks, at the end of the line, counting 4 beats and only moving their eyes to the beginning of the second line when the downbeat of measure 7 arrived. And in fact, they would consistently fall apart because they hadn't been looking ahead at that material because they've been staring at that long note there instead. In contrast, As the more effortless readers reached the last measure in the first line, I could see their eyes move quickly to the second line while they were still sustaining the long note at the end of the previous line. It seemed that the old studio teacher admonition to read ahead separated one kind of sight reader from the other. John Sloboda found that music reading involves what he called dual coding mechanisms, one visual and one abstract, the latter of which allows musicians to see, understand, and remember more from a single brief glance at music notation than non-musicians get. And we can conclude from this with C.P.E. Bach that performers should, quote, always look ahead to the approaching notes, unquote. This and other ocular behaviors have been documented empirically in a pair of important reports by Thomas Goolsby. Now let me tell you about Goolsby's research. It's really quite interesting. He used a thing called the Purkinje eye tracker, and it can take the letter O in 12-point type and tell you where your eyes are looking in one of 6 positions within that letter O. It's really amazingly accurate and can tell you where your eyes are focusing. What Goolsby did then was to have musicians read music in real time, make recordings of their reading, and then also make a recording of where their eyes were looking at the page. And these results that you get from an eye tracker have little dots which are called the points of focus, and then lines that are called saccades. And apparently we're doing this all day long. We're either focusing or we're in saccades. Focus, saccade, focus, saccade. That's the way our eyes work. It's either one of those two conditions, and then you get these things that have a dot for a focus, a line for a saccade, a dot, and then the eye goes back, and it ends up scratching around the page in music that way. So what he got was this static image of what a sight reader had done during the entire process, and then a recording of that person's sight reading. And then he took those recordings without showing the eye tracking patterns and played the recordings for music faculty and said, please grade this. I forget whether it was A, B, C, D, or 100% or whatever. But then he categorized them into strong sight readers and weak sight readers, and there were some clear differences between the ocular behaviors between those two groups. Now, one thing that Goolsby did not do, which I think would be very interesting, would be to time the fixations and the saccades with the recordings. He didn't do that. At the end of the result, all you got was this image of where the eyes had been, but you don't know when they were where, and then these recordings of what the musicians had done. But here's some of his findings. First, music reading is music perception because music notation is processed before performance. Okay. 2, skilled music readers look farther ahead in the notation and then back to the point of performance when sight reading. 3, unlike the less skilled sight reader, the skilled subject does not process the melody note by note, but rather looks at a group. 4, a skilled subject uses long note values, half notes or longer, to scan about the notation, whereas less skilled readers fixate on as much of the notation as time allows, looking at this note value while performing that note value, looking at that note value while performing that one, and so on. For skilled readers, some system of chunking is used to grasp more than one note or item in visual detail. During a single fixation of the eyes on the page, these readers would take in a group of information. So they might stare at this, stare at this, stare at this. They might look at these 3 notes here, then those 3 notes there. And their eyes move back and forth among them, but always staring in the middle of things. One of the other things I noticed in looking at Goolsby's results is that the weaker sight readers were actually staring at all the note heads, and the stronger sight readers were in general sort of looking in the middle of the staff like this. One of the I didn't note this in the paper, one of the coolest results I thought was that they were always looking in the middle of the staff, but the very best sight readers were picking up tempo and dynamic and articulation information even without looking outside of the staff. There's a kind of vertical peripheral vision going on there. As far as I know, there's never been anything written about that, and in fact most eye tracking research is about reading language, and there's no real, with the exception of diacritical marks or whatever, there's no real vertical peripheral vision necessary. But in music we use it all the time to pick up things like dynamics and articulation and so on. Unfortunately, there's no paper and pencil test for this kind of eye movement. And so what do? I mean, Goolsby used a complex eye tracking device, the kind found in some university psychology labs. Nor is there any single drill to develop the specific kind of skills in reading ahead and chunking necessary for skilled reading. But simply forcing students to read ahead by continually covering up a reasonably sized group of pitches currently being sung, up to about a half a dozen notes, perhaps a measure or a half measure if the music's very busy. That can indeed help to foster the habit of looking ahead while reading music. So one of the drills that we'll work on with our aural skills students is simply, while we're singing this measure, you grab an F for me there. Thank you, sir. All right. So we go like, do, re, mi, so, fa, mi, re, so. Do, re, mi, fa, so, fa, mi, re. And you see what you're doing? Re, do, ti, do, re, so, la, ti, and so on like that. So by me covering up that G at the end of the first line, forced you to look ahead and do something with that information. That's, 7 or 8 notes worth of information. That might be a little much, so you might want to just cover up the first half of the measure and the second half of the measure. But actually covering up the measure can make all the difference in the world. This kind of drill cannot, in and of itself, make readers chunk meaningful units, but at least it forces the eyes to read ahead and take in something before performing it. And this is then in line with the kinds of information we're getting about how the visual systems in our brains and in our eyes process this kind of stuff. As readers' theoretical knowledge and speed of comprehension grow, so too can their abilities to parse meaningful chunks with this advanced field of vision. In conclusion, words you've been wanting to hear, the field of music cognition is expanding rapidly. Many new articles and books appear every year, and more appear in the next year than in the last. The wealth of information they offer about how musicians hear and read music can be extremely valuable to us pedagogues. I encourage each and every one of you, when you think about teaching aural skills or teaching music in general, to eschew the temptation to say, I've always done it that way, or we've always done it that way, and instead say, let's find better ways. Thank you.
Now I know for a fact that we've got a room full of questions, because I've got 5, so I can multiply that by the number of people here. However, I also know that there are a lot of people who've got to move on.
If you need to go, I'm not insulted in any way.
I think actually the best thing to do would be, I've got some bottles of wine up here, I'm going to run and get some juice and things as well, and we've got some snacks, is to do questions informly, if you don't mind.
Sure, no, that's fine. Yeah, as long as everybody's involved.
Yeah,
that's good.
yeah.
Yep.
And come up, please, and have a glass of something, and ask Gary your questions up here. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gary.
Thank you. My pleasure.